Imagine standing on the narrow deck of a Viking longship as a cold spray bites your face. 65 men sit shoulder to shoulder on low benches, oars locked in a rhythm that sounds like a heartbeat. The freeboard, the distance from the waterline to the top of the ship's side, is barely half a meter. Wool is wet, leather creaks. The wind carries the smell of salt, smoke, and the faintness of damp wool, not the heavy stench you might expect from so many bodies sharing such close quarters for days or weeks at a time. It's an odd, even unsettling scene. A vessel designed for speed, raiding, and long-range travel, yet with no sign of a private latrine, no enclosed heads, and no obvious onboard sanitation. How did these men keep their longships clean and avoid the kind of shipboard sickness that later navies suffered? Evidence suggests they did it not with a single invention, but with a system. 3 interlocking strategies that turned the ocean itself, the shoreline, and a set of cultural practices into an improvised sanitation network. If you enjoy deep historical explanations like this, subscribe and stay with me. The full picture takes a few steps to assemble. The puzzle begins in the archaeology. When modern excavators unearth the bones of a longship, they expect to find the trappings of life at sea, tools, weapons, perhaps the remains of provisions. What they seldom find are fixed toilets, drainage channels, or built-in cesspits. Some of the most famous finds underline the point. The richly furnished Oseberg ship, recovered from a burial mound in Norway, yielded ornate combs, tweezers, and textile tools, objects tied to grooming and personal care, but no evidence of a built-in latrine. The Gogstad ship and the vessel catalogued as Heddabiwal similarly show deliberate absence of permanent sanitation fixtures. Across surveys of Viking hulls and fragments, archaeologists consistently encounter workarounds rather than engineered onboard latrines. This absence is itself meaningful. In many later seafaring traditions, especially from the age of sail onward, ships enclosed their holds and struggled with concentrated human waste, leading to recurring outbreaks of gastrointestinal disease and infestations. Viking ships, by contrast, were built with a different set of priorities and constraints. Shallow draft for beach landings, low freeboard for speed and easy boarding, and a clinker-built hull, overlapping planks fastened by iron rivets. These design choices created an operational context where waste management solutions compatible with seafaring, speed, and the environments they traversed were possible. Archaeological patterns and medieval observers point toward a 3-part explanation that fits both the material record and the practical realities of Viking voyaging. First, immediate dispersal and active bilge management, using the ocean as a diluting sink. Second, frequent beaching and shore resets, taking advantage of the longship's shallow draft to relieve, wash, and refresh on land. Third, cultural hygiene and provisioning, regular grooming, scheduled washing days, and staple drinks that were less likely to carry pathogens than stored fresh water. Together, these strategies created a dynamic, distributed sanitation system rather than a fixed onboard solution. Let's unpack the first element, immediate dispersal and hull dynamics. A longship's low freeboard meant that anything thrown over the side landed in the sea almost immediately. Human waste could be disposed of directly into the ocean. A bucket or even a swing of the arm would suffice. That sounds crude, but from an epidemiological standpoint, it matters. Pathogens in human feces become dangerous when they accumulate in sufficient concentration and when they find routes into bodies of people, through contaminated drinking water, food, or vectors like flies and lice. When waste enters the open sea, it undergoes rapid dilution. The salt water disperses organic material over a vast medium. Currents and turbulence reduce local concentrations quickly. The ocean, in effect, becomes a giant moving sink. This mechanism, dilution by seawater, was supported by the ship's own construction. Clinker-built planks overlap and are caulked with fibers and tar, but they are not hermetically sealed. The seams allow some seepage, and the bilge, the lowest part of the hull where water collects, was a place crews actively managed. Bailing out bilge water was a routine task, often performed with leather buckets and pumps, and that kept the bilge free of stagnant pools, where microbes and vectors like flies could thrive. On a longship, stagnant interior water would quickly become a breeding ground. By contrast, the constant movement, seepage, and manual pumping meant the interior seldom became an enclosed repository for waste. Archaeological finds reinforce this. Excavations frequently turn up the tools of bailing and repair rather than the architecture of a head. Leather buckets, wooden bailers, and evidence of frequent maintenance indicate a crew trained to keep water moving out of the hull. Medieval chroniclers echo the impression of active, hands-on seamanship. When Ahmad ibn Fadlan, an Arab diplomat and observer, met Norse crews on the Volga, he described ritualized cleanliness, combing, and communal practices, details that fit the idea of frequent, habitual attention to the body and immediate surroundings. It is not a stretch to imagine that bailing, emptying buckets overboard, and throwing waste into the sea were normalized activities, performed in the rhythm of the voyage. But immediate dispersal had its limits and must be understood as one part of a system. For one, throwing waste overboard is only safe when the ship is moving or the sea is turbulent enough to disperse solids. In calm, sheltered waters or in proximity to harbors and fjords, local concentrations could rise and create a hazard to people ashore or to other anchored ships. Additionally, during storms and heavy weather, crews could not safely expose themselves to the waterline to dispose of waste, creating moments of risk. Archaeological and textual evidence both show the Vikings were not immune to health problems. Intestinal parasites, chronic abscesses, and localized outbreaks occurred. The immediate dispersal mechanism reduced some risks but did not eliminate disease. The second strategy complements the first, beaching and shore-based resets. Longships were deliberately shallow-drafted craft. Draft is the depth of a ship's hull below the waterline. Shallow draft permits a vessel to approach beaches and riverbanks without grounding. This mobility meant that Viking crews seldom had to remain enclosed at sea for the entire voyage. They beached to make repairs, to take on or offload cargo, to water horses and pack animals, and to rest and wash. Frequent landings allowed crews to relieve themselves on shore, wash clothing and bodies, and reset the sanitary burden away from the ship into the absorbing soils and running fresh water sources of a coastline, at least in places they controlled or where populations were sparse. Consider how a typical stop might work. A longship sliding onto sand at low tide, the bow driven up and the keel resting outside the waterline. Men step off, stretch, and unlace straps. Laundry is beaten on rocks or rinsed in a nearby stream. Leather buckets and wooden tubs appear, and men attend to their hands and beards. Archaeology supports the reality of these shore resets. At coastal trading centers and seasonal bases, Torksey is mentioned in contemporary sources as a wintering site, and other hub locations along the North Sea and Baltic coasts functioned as regular stopovers. Excavations reveal concentrations of discarded organic waste and signs of repeated communal activity. The pattern suggests that shorelines became the extant latrines of a maritime culture. Shore resets also had strategic benefits beyond waste disposal. They allowed for larger-scale cleaning and maintenance, drying and airing of woolen garments, curing of leather, and repairs to ropes and sails. These tasks, when deferred until landfall, reduced the amount of work and risk concentrated on the ship. The practice of beaching meant the ship itself remained relatively free of the kind of damp and closed environments that favor persistent contamination. Yet this too carried consequences. Offloading waste onto beaches and into estuaries concentrated contamination in particular coastal nodes. Archaeologists have noted that trading centers and popular landing spots exhibit elevated levels of organic deposits and, in some cases, parasite remnants in soil layers. From a historical ecological perspective, the Vikings traded a distributed risk at sea for concentrated impacts ashore. In areas with dense human settlement, that could translate into repeated local exposure for resident populations and their domestic animals. It was an effective strategy for keeping ships operational. It was not a zero-sum solution for public health across a landscape. The third leg of the Viking sanitation strategy is cultural hygiene and provisioning. Material culture, combs, tweezers, small grooming kits, show up in graves and ship burials. The Osberg grave, in particular, is famous for the quantity and quality of personal grooming tools it contained. These are not decorative luxuries, but evidence of habitual practices. Combing hair and removing lice were regular activities. A comb is a basic public health tool in situations where lice could spread quickly among a tightly packed crew. Comb use reduces the vector load and can prevent secondary skin infections. Archaeology's frequent discovery of grooming implements across Viking contexts suggests these acts were ordinary, almost ritualized. Written accounts add color and confirmation. Ahmed ibn Fadlan noted that when Norsemen landed, they would wrap a reed around their hair and comb frequently. Other observers described bathing days. The Old Norse term laugardag, literally bathing day, points to a weekly rhythm of washing, often associated with communal hot water or steam bathing when conditions allowed. John of Wallingford and other medieval chroniclers mention similar rhythms of washing and cleanliness among seafaring groups, even if their accounts are filtered through foreign impressions. Provisioning choices reinforced these practices. Fermented beverages, beer, sour milk, were staples on many voyages. Fermentation and boiling are processes that reduce microbial hazards. When water is boiled to make brackish tea, or when beer is brewed and then consumed, the heat involved and the acidity of fermentation effectively lower the risk of ingesting live pathogens compared to drinking stagnant, non-treated fresh water from a barrel. Sailors who habitually drank brewed beverages or fermented milk rather than stored fresh water had one less route of fecal-oral transmission to worry about. Archaeological finds of drinking vessels and residues, together with ethnographic parallels, make this a plausible part of the picture. Another cultural habit that mattered was the strong norm around shared labor and mutual oversight. Shipboard life in a longship was intensely communal. Tasks like bailing, rowing, and caring for equipment were shared. That social structure supports rapid adoption of routine sanitation practices. If everyone participates in bailing and washing, it becomes a distributed responsibility rather than an occasional chore. This mutuality can lower overall risk by ensuring that the minimal tasks required to keep water moving and bodies clean are performed consistently. Still, no combination of architecture and culture completely eliminated disease. Archaeological evidence of parasitic eggs in sediment layers, osteological signs of chronic infections, and historical accounts all indicate that Vikings faced ongoing health burdens. Shared bowls, communal sleeping, and times when ships were anchored for prolonged periods created opportunities for transmission. In stormy weather or during long stretches without suitable landing spots, the advantages of immediate dispersal and shore resets diminish. The system was robust, not perfect. To appreciate the significance of the Viking approach, compare it with some later naval histories. By the 18th and 19th centuries, many warships and merchant vessels sealed their holds more tightly and carried large numbers of men for extended periods without regular landfall. Ships like the HMS Thunderer and others in the Age of Sail had dedicated heads, early toilets. But the confined, often poorly ventilated spaces and the storage of fresh water in barrels created persistent problems. Without the frequent flushing of seawater or the ability to beach, waste and contaminated water accumulated.
These conditions contributed to the epidemics and high morbidity seen on many vessels of those eras. The Viking strategy did not invent germ theory, but it embodied an empirical, practical method for reducing risk under specific constraints. We must emphasize caution. What we can say with confidence is that the combination of ship design, the practice of frequent beaching, and cultural hygiene behaviors make a plausible, evidence-supported explanation for why Viking crews often avoided the catastrophic outbreaks recorded elsewhere. That is to say, the archaeological pattern and the historical accounts point toward a system that lowered the likelihood of high transmission events at sea. They do not prove, beyond doubt, that any specific voyage escaped certain diseases entirely. The evidence is a strong circumstantial case, multiple lines of data converging on the same operational logic. Anchoring this argument in physical realities helps. The Longship's low freeboard made overboard disposal straightforward. The clinker construction and active bailing prevented the prolonged stagnation of bilge water. The shallow draft allowed near-continuous access to the shore, and crude rituals of grooming and scheduled washing reduced vectors like lice. Provisioning with fermented and boiled liquids lowered ingestion risk. Each step reduced a specific route of transmission: environmental accumulation of waste, vector proliferation in damp holds, ingestion of contaminated water, and direct person-to-person spread via ectoparasites. When combined, these measures form a layered defense, not unlike modern public health strategies that use multiple interventions to lower overall risk. But there are deeper trade-offs and ethical questions to acknowledge.
The system's reliance on the sea and the shore moved problems rather than eliminating them. Beaches and estuaries near trading centers could become concentrated dumping grounds, affecting local populations and ecosystems. Archaeological layers near recurring landing sites show a buildup of organic debris and waste-related residues. In some cases, parasite evidence indicates that certain infections became endemic in coastal communities that served as frequent Viking ports. The convenience for a seafaring crew meant a cost for people who lived on the shore, and for the animals and plants of those environments. That trade-off is an important part of the historical record and a cautionary lesson about the uneven distribution of risk in human systems. We should also be clear about the limits imposed by the sea itself. During stormy weather, when the crew is lashed down and the ship is rolling, disposing of waste overboard becomes dangerous or impossible. In those moments, hygiene practices were difficult to maintain. The archaeological record reveals injuries, infections, and bone pathologies consistent with the harsh life at sea. It is not a story of triumph over every hazard, but of practical adaptation to reduce particular risks associated with a mobile maritime lifestyle. The story of Viking sanitation is also a story about cultural priorities and knowledge embedded in material practice. Vikings did not design their ships explicitly with bacteriology in mind. That science did not exist. Rather, they made choices driven by mobility, speed, tactical flexibility, and the realities of their environment. Those choices yielded ancillary benefits for health. The lesson here is one of constraint-driven resilience. Design and routine that embrace the limits of an environment can produce effective outcomes. The ocean's vastness was enlisted as a sanitation partner. Shorelines were treated as sites for reset. Social norms and provisioning reduced vectors and ingestion risks. Together, these choices formed a coherent system tuned to the needs of exploration, trade, and survival. A few illustrative moments bring this into focus. Picture a crew after a day of rowing. The ship is beached at dusk, men scramble ashore, hammers ring as planks are checked, someone pours boiling water over a pot to scald utensils and makes a small batch of ale. Others set up a wash area and comb each other's hair, removing lice, while a few carry out a quick burial of organic waste beyond the high tide line. An illustrative reconstruction. These are simple, practical acts. They are not medical innovations, they are habits formed in the logic of a life lived between sea and shore. Returning to that opening deck, the cold spray, the creaking planks, 65 men rowing in unison, what looked like an improbable survival scenario now appears less mystifying. The longship was not a floating hospital, but it was a platform for disciplined, mutually enforced routines and design features that together reduced the risk of major outbreaks at sea. The ocean diluted, the shore reset, and culture disciplined behavior. Archaeology and chronicles converge on this threefold explanation as the most convincing account we have. Immediate overboard dispersal and bilge management, deliberate and frequent beaching to offload sanitary burdens, and cultural practices, grooming, scheduled washing, and provisioning that lowered vectors and ingestion risks. The broader insight is not that Vikings were cleaner in some absolute moral sense, but that they engineered resilience through an interplay of material design and social ritual. They worked with the environment, making the ocean and shoreline parts of their living system, rather than trying to recreate a completely sealed and self-contained world. That approach had costs as well as benefits. It safeguarded seamanship and mobility, but concentrated environmental impacts ashore and did not prevent all disease. Yet, for the purposes of long-range voyaging and settlement, it was a pragmatic solution that supported expansion, trade, and the seafaring culture we now study. In the end, the answer to the question in the title, How Vikings Kept Their Longships Clean and Avoided Sickness, lies in integration. There was no single magical invention. The cleanliness of longships was the result of architecture, routine, provisioning, and seamanship combined into a single operational culture. That combination made voyages possible, allowed ships to be ready for action, and reduced the frequency of catastrophic outbreaks at sea. It is a reminder that sometimes the best solutions are not dramatic innovations, but consistent, distributed practices shaped by environment and necessity. If this deep dive sparked your curiosity, like and share the video, check the description for further reading and source links, and consider watching the next episode where we examine how Viking food preservation fit into the same pattern of constraint-driven resilience.